Hello, my name is Sean Kelly. I'm the Archive Education Technologist at the East Anglian Film Archive. And in this presentation, I hope to reflect on the topic of preserving the unpreservable as part of the Collections Care Conference, looking at the work that we do at the East Anglian Film Archive and how that interacts and relates particularly with digital technology. My main role at the archive as the Archive Education Technologist is facilitating the use of the archive in education and research. I do this in collaboration with the academic director at IIIF, but I also work with other staff in other areas, from collections care to collections information and digital preservation and the development of digital workflows. And I kind of want to emphasize before I go on that we're a small team at the archive, and a lot of the work that I'm presenting here isn't work that I've done on my own or have necessarily been a major part of. I'm kind of trying to present and communicate the work of a team and the expertise of our small team. So the East Anglian Film Archive is a regional moving image archive, and we collect, preserve and make accessible moving images of the east of England. This is defined as Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Essex, Hertfordshire, Norfolk and Suffolk. Traditionally, we often might think of East Anglia as being Norfolk and Suffolk, but the nature of the regional moving image archives means that we kind of cover kind of a larger area. There's only a small number of us, and so we tend to cover multiple counties that we represent. And we are based in Norwich at the Archive Centre, which we share with the Norfolk Record Office, but we're also part of the University of East Anglia. And our collection comprises of approximately 75,000 catalogue titles across 148,000 physical items. We have film holdings dating back to the 1890s, so the invention of cinema, and we believe we have approximately 42,000 hours of content on film and video. The archive is relatively young in terms of moving image archives. We were founded in 1976, but we are probably one of the oldest regional moving image archives. But as I say, we're quite young in respect to archives such as the Imperial War Museum's film section, which kind of came about following World War One, and is one of the oldest film archives in the world from 1918, and also the British Film Institute's National Archive, which was founded not long after that. As a regional moving image archive, the collection and the reflection of content based upon the region means that we often have what we might refer to as more ephemeral films. These are films that have not necessarily been published or seen broadly in their original use. So, for example, amateur films, these could be home movies, but also local documentaries or films made by local film groups. Films made by regional companies, this could be internal training or promotion and advertising and publicity. And then we have quite large collections, like a large proportion of our collection is the BBC East and Anglia television collections, so two kind of regional television collections. And although a lot of these collections is local news, we also have productions going back to the 1950s, particularly of Anglia television, of game shows and dramas and all the kind of production material that they were creating. Another large collection that we have is the Institute of Amateur Cinematographers collection, and this is an international collection of amateur fiction and non-fiction films that are kind of award-winning films. So a kind of a broad range of materials that we hold across many different formats. In terms of the use of the collections, day to day, we have people that will be accessing our website and watching videos there, but we also work with partners in outreach projects to present film and film shows. We license our material for use in television and films. We have internal projects such as the mashup competition, where we provide access to material and we ask people to reflect on that and create new films, so kind of creative reuse of content. And we also have research projects. And one research project I wanted to highlight was just an ongoing project that's been developing over a number of years, looking at women filmmakers that we've been part of. It's currently its third iteration, called Women in Focus. But this is the front cover from an output from the second iteration, which is a report written by Stephanie Clayton, Keith Johnston and Melanie Williams at the UEA, kind of giving an overview of amateur women filmmaker collections in the country, in the UK. The most recent iteration of this project is looking at the cataloguing of and creating descriptions of films made by women and looking at the ways that we can make them more visible and highlight them. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that as one of the projects that we're kind of part of, which is in its current version, a partnership between the UEA and Maynooth University. And the first iteration of that Women Filmmakers project was the digitisation and cataloguing of 250 films that were then made available on our website. And this is really one of the main ways that we provide access to our content nowadays, is via our website to an international audience. The website was originally launched with video in 2012, coming out of a funded project where we digitized a large number of films, and currently the website has many hundreds of hours of film that can be watched online for free. Our senior technician, Peter Fairchild, I feel has been quite progressive and was an early adopter of digitization of film and video. And we've been digitizing film and video with workflow since 2006. And this was initially in standard definition, so more focusing on like accessibility and access copies of digital files. We've now acquired a film scanner and are currently scanning at, I call it 2K, just in terms of it's slightly more than 2K. It's actually just under 4K, but once you kind of crop your image and prepare it, we kind of master to 2K in our final versions. And we currently have approximately 1,000 hours of film and 4,500 hours of this video that's digitized. And this 4,500 of digitized video has kind of come about in more recent years, and I'll talk about some of those projects a little bit later. Currently, archival storage is in the hundreds of terabytes. Just to give an overview, when we digitize the vast majority of our films at standard definition, we were looking at approximately 92 gigabytes per hour of content. We stored those as uncompressed standard definition files. With our current film scanner, scanning at a much higher resolution, we currently create about a terabyte per file. That's not including any of the backups, for example. And our video is currently being stored in a format called FFV1, which I might talk about in a bit. And yeah, there's many benefits to that in terms of its development, in terms of lossless or mathematically lossless compression. So we can store those files in smaller file sizes, but we don't lose any information when we decode them back and play them back. There's quite a long process in terms of digitization, but the final outcome is that we store our material in our tape library. And that's one of the benefits we've found of being part of the University of East Anglia, is that we get to kind of collaborate and work with the IT infrastructure that we have available to us. So we essentially kind of rent space in the tape store at the university and have access to that as archival storage. Before I go on, I wanted to also talk a little bit about the nature of film and digitization authenticity. So I also wanted to emphasize this idea of there's a long history with film, particularly when we create film negatives and then created film positives, that there's a quality of film which was the duplication of it. And there are many people that argue that when we digitize film, it's a continuum of this process, like it's just a continuum of this idea of duplication, which has kind of happened with moving image history going back to the 1890s. Whereas other people argue that digitization is kind of a clear break and it's like an ontological shift into a new kind of system. But I just really here want to emphasize this idea of the continuum and the ongoing idea of digitization and the idea of authenticity that's tied to that. So one example that I think is a useful reflection is that you can have quite rare color systems such as Dufaycolor, which are very unique, and they have kind of very particular color characteristics. So Dufaycolor is a system where the fundamental storage of the medium on the base via the emulsion is black and white. So the system is black and white, but the color comes about from this matrices. So the light is filtered through the matrices of red, green, and blue, and then the information is stored in a black and white photographic image, and then the color is recreated via an additive process as light is passed through the film. That's kind of a huge simplification, but hopefully that makes sense. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that if we were to duplicate this using modern color photochemical film stocks, it can be very difficult to kind of create the original qualities of the Dufaycolor. And this is where digital is really beneficial sometimes. So digital can actually allow us with current color grading tools to get to a better, I would argue, more authentic approximation of the original and what it would have looked like. I also wanted just to mention about the model of film preservation and duplication and what that means in terms of access and preservation. In moving image archives, when we have this master material, particularly if it's like a negative, for example, it can often mean that there's a process that we have to go through before we can provide access to material. So we often want to secure it in terms of preservation and then make access copies before we make access or provide access. So we can't, for example, just provide access to master material. If it's a negative, it wouldn't make much sense. It would be an inverted image. But also, if it's kind of the original master element that we have, because of the process that it has to go through for presentation. So there's like a mechanical process, either on a flatbed viewer, film scanner if it's being digitized, and more traditionally a projector. These are kind of mechanical processes in terms of film performance that put the film at risk. So we kind of want to make access copies before we can provide access. But this is kind of a push and pull thing, because you can argue that if you're not providing access to your material, you haven't preserved it. But it's really important to make sure we preserve it before we provide access, because otherwise you can put the material at risk in the long term. And I think this is often can be very different to more traditional archives, where I know it's not always the case, but for example, you are able to potentially provide access to original papers in the reading room, as long as they've been processed and inspected and people have checked them for any preservation issues. Essentially, you can provide access to original documents, and that's kind of a bit rarer in a moving image environment. And this idea of authenticity and accessibility does kind of lead into digital preservation as well. In Adrian Brown's book, A How-To Guide for Organizations of Any Size in terms of digital preservation, he provides this very useful definition of digital preservation, where he says the digital preservation is the process of maintaining a digital object for as long as required in a form which is both authentic and accessible to users. So he kind of really ties together this idea of the definition of preservation being based on being both authentically duplicated or an authentic experience, that we recreate the look and feel of the object, but also that accessibility is kind of baked into the requirements for long-term preservation. We haven't really completed preservation until we can also provide access to our materials. So far I've focused on film, but I want to shift a little bit to video. At the East Anglian Film Archive, when we initially were developing digitization workflows, it kind of came about from funded projects that there was a stronger focus on the digitization and making access to or making accessible our photochemical films, so digitizing films, providing access to them. But it's really in the last, I'd say, 15 years that there's been a shift in the discussion around the need to migrate our videotape. And so it's kind of a different model, a model of obsolescence. And what I mean by that is that we can now currently buy still brand new film scanners. Film scanners are being manufactured, and you can purchase different kinds of gates for your film scanner to run different gauges of different formats. And this means that you can still buy a new machine now that can digitize films from the very beginning of cinema in the 1890s. But this is not true with video. Videotape and the many formats that were developed, they had a model of obsolescence where when a new format was developed by, say, Sony or Panasonic, they would eventually stop creating and supporting the old formats. And with videotape, we require very specific proprietary video machines to be able to play back these tapes. And so at the moment, there's really a model of migration. We need to, and it's a race against time because there's finite parts. We have many different kind of video formats, and we need to migrate off of these analog and legacy video formats. And here's just a few images from one of our tech rooms at the archive where, we have up to a point replaceable parts, usually for perishable bits such as the bands that go into the machines, for example, and we maintain a number of decks that we can use for spares. But as I say, there's only a finite number of machines that are available, and so over time it will become harder and harder to be able to digitize these tapes. So they do need to be digitized and migrated. Whereas with film, as I mentioned, we can still digitize films and purchase machines to do that, and we maintain the original film objects in our vaults as well. And so, coming out of that discussion, that shift, as part of the British Film Institute's National Archives strategy for 2017 to 2022, they had a project called Heritage 2022, and this focused on the need to mass digitize videotape from across the regions. This old Guardian article mentions TV shows, but really it became a project about more broad born video preservation. So the idea was that the British Film Institute digitized 50,000 tapes from their own institution, and then another 50,000 tapes from across the regions. And as part of this project, the East Anglia Film Archive was able to submit over 4,000 videotapes for digitisation, and we're still tallying up the final runtime because not all of it has come back yet, but we're looking at approximately 3,500 to 4,000 hours of content. So that's where a lot of the bulk of what I mentioned at the beginning in terms of videotape digitisation has really come from. Part of the Heritage 2022 project kind of came about at the same time as the development of the No Time to Wait conference, and this is the conference that looks at open source tools and frameworks and their use in video and film preservation. And this is a screenshot from a blog post written by Ashley Blue about the third iteration of this conference that took place in 2018. And I highlight this one particularly because it was hosted by the British Film Institute, and kind of lots of things were kind of coming to fruition with regards to discussions that are coming out of this conference and things that had happened with partners that are kind of around this conference, such as Media Area and the standardization and ratification of formats such as FFV1, which I mentioned earlier. And so part of this network and knowledge share meant that the British Film Institute actually offered FFV1 as one of the digitization outputs of the project, and that's something that we adopted. So learning from this conference and the tools that are available and discussions that were happening at the British Film Institute, we kind of got on board and adopted the use of FFV1 as our video format. As I mentioned, one of the benefits of that format is that it's open source, so all the information is very open and can be used in the future in terms of source code to recreate tools to facilitate the use of those materials. But it also has some very useful built-in features. One is, as I mentioned, mathematically lossless compression. So essentially you can save space on your storage without losing any information. While you're storing the file, it's smaller, it's compressed, but all that information is done mathematically lossless. So when you decode it and play it back, you have all the information that was there and you encoded it. It also has some very useful features such as inbuilt fixity checking. So it has inbuilt integrity checking and can tell you when a particular frame has been corrupted, for example, in the future. And from that network, we kind of gathered and gained knowledge that allowed us to develop our own internal project. So I think I might have mentioned Pete already, Pete Fairchild, our senior technician, and he, using some of his expertise he already had, but some things that we've been looking at in terms of tools that had come about from these conferences and discussions, he developed a workflow and hardware workstations and designed systems for video digitization, or a new form of video digitization in-house. And we had funding to develop that infrastructure. And then we had an additional piece of funding more recently under the project title of Fast Forwarding Video Preservation and Digital Engagement that looked at using this infrastructure. And we worked with students at the university over the summer last year to digitize over 600 hours of videotape. And I'm not sure how well this will capture on a screen capture that's then uploaded to YouTube, but this is just a video of one of our 1-inch videos being digitized on one of those workstations using some of the open source tools that kind of we learned about and kind of came about from discussions at the No Time to Wait conference. With these video projects, particularly the BFI one, something that we became aware of was a challenge with regards to the preservation and then accessibility of audio channels on some of the more legacy professional video formats. So there's not an issue in terms of capture, but some of the professional video formats have up to 4 channels of audio, and one of those channels is often used for storing timecode in an audio channel. And then one of those channels might be used for capturing audio on site, on location, during like news gathering, for example. And then another channel might be used for voiceover. And it's not always consistent in terms of different institutions, different broadcasters working in different ways, maybe even different engineers. And so you can never guarantee what the pattern of the channels will be. And so this is fine in terms of capture. We can capture all 4 channels in our digital preservation workflow, but there's a question about how we then present that to the public, because if you flatten it all down, there's a risk that, for example, you present the time code, which is just kind of like noise that you don't really want to be hearing in your presentation version. And also, you can't always just flatten down the original audio as captured on location, and in the voiceover, they kind of can sometimes overlay on each other, and then you can't actually discern what is even being said. There might be overlapping dialogue, for example. And so often you need to actually play back the video and decide on what channel you might want to use in a particular version for presentation. So that's kind of a challenge that we do face at the moment in terms of making these more accessible in the future. But again, other open source tools that have come about from this network that for us kind of centers around No Time to Wait and the networks we've developed there, and stuff that's been led by the British Film Institute as well, we became aware of tools such as QC tools. And this is a suite that allows you to essentially analyze the outputs of your recording. So we use a piece of called vRecord for capturing our information and monitoring it, but then afterwards you can run it through QC tools and you kind of get an analysis of your video capture. And you can kind of use this to do like a deep reading of the materials that we have. So for example, in the past, it could have been quite tricky. You had information on your labels, on your tapes, but you didn't really know, or you couldn't trust necessarily what was on those labels until it had been captured. But with digitization, we can get the digitization done and then do an analysis of like thousands of files at once and try and find patterns and understand how audio is being laid out on these video formats. So it kind of allows from a certain level of automation in terms of just decision making on what channels to present in an access copy. Something that we can always return to if we find any errors, for example. But it kind of really changes the way that we interact with digital objects in terms of being able to do deep kind of mass reading of data. I should mention there as well, there are other tools that we use, such as Media Info, which is a tool that allows us to kind of characterize the nature and the technical metadata of the materials that we have, the digital materials we have. And yeah, there's some useful tools. And then before I go on, just to mention about like this idea of knowledge, I think that's something that's can be hard to preserve, and I wanted to highlight this project that the Austrian Film Museum have been working on, which was ways to actually disseminate and share and capture and preserve the knowledge of technical staff. This might be film lab technicians as they retire, but also engineers that worked on video and broadcast. And there's lots of really important information that we need to capture to maintain and be able to understand what we're dealing with when we digitize these legacy audiovisual formats. And so at this point, I just wanted to kind of look at the future as well. So this is just the capture from the homepage of the Story Trails project. And this was a project looking at new ways of reusing materials. In this example, like augmented reality. And the East Anglian Film Archive wasn't directly part of this project, but we were invited and staff went to some training events that were part of this. But the output of this project for other regional moving image archives is that they provided material that was then used to create kind of these heritage tours of cities. And what would happen is there's an app and you open up the app, and as an example, you would have archive film that was playing in the location that was originally shot as you were situated in that location, and you can kind of overlay it on your screen on your phone. So it's kind of interactive experience in that way. And I just wanted to mention this as a way of thinking through new ways of using archive film in new forms of screen culture. And again, this ties back to the BFI. After the Heritage 2022 project, the BFI have announced their next 10-year plan, and they're kind of really prioritizing this idea of screen culture more broadly. So historically, we would often think of the British Film Institute's National Archive as focused on film and video, like film, television, and the video around that. And they're really kind of emphasizing this need to engage more broadly with screen culture as a whole. So this can be what we might refer to as XR, which can be like virtual reality and augmented reality, 360 video, but also video that's being placed on social media and different ways that we are interacting with video now. And this can also include, for example, video games and other ways that we work with video. I just wanted to mention this in terms of the future of our archive and the development of the collections. We are definitely collecting and looking to scale up our collection of born digital moving image material. but there's still a question about the boundaries about what we will and will not collect, for example. One case study might be in the future if there's a particularly prominent regional YouTuber or a person that's making content and publishing it online, how we might work with them in terms of helping them maintain their content and in the future potentially taking it into the archive. But when would we not take in other forms of screen culture? And do we need to develop expertise for that, or would that be the role of a different kind of institution? So there's lots of questions there in terms of the future and the boundaries of what we will and will not be collecting. And then just to close, I wanted to look a bit more at traditional film and its relationship to digital again. So this is an image of one of our previous members of staff inspecting some film on the winding bench. And this is kind of a process that we go through when we're preparing film. We kind of process it, we look at the film on the bench, and we learn a lot about it. And this is kind of to record information that we don't see when we present it to the public, for example. So there's lots of information that when you're winding through a film on a bench that you discover. It's a very different experience, like the performative motion picture tradition of seeing the film performed. But I think it's also a very valid kind of authentic experience. And so from this, we can learn about color systems. For example, we learn that this film is Kodachrome. We see the dating symbols, this plus and this L, which gives us information about the date that the film was manufactured. It tells us it's safety film. There's lots of things that you can kind of learn about your elements from looking at them on a winding bench. This is also where we also inspect the film for shrinkage, etc., and check for splice integrity if there are splices and joins. All that information is recorded as metadata. But I think it could be useful to be able to present this as well to the public. So at the moment, when we digitize our films, we do digitize at what we call overscan. And this means that we capture, or we try and represent the film as a digital object, not just the content on the film. So our actual digitized masters include edge information as well, that we then kind of zoom and crop and then grade for presentation purposes. But I do think there could be potential for thinking through in the future means to be able to present this version of certain films in certain examples. One way we might be able to do that in the future is potentially via IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework. We don't currently use this, and it's still very early in its adoption of video. It's primarily at the moment used for images. And I came about it via talks with staff at the Cambridge Digital Library when they visited the university, and they gave a presentation about some of the work they're doing. And in that example, IIIF is being used to kind of recreate the structure of a book, for example. So you have a series of digitized images that represent each page of the book, and then using IIIF and the framework and metadata, you can kind of present that online as a book where you have pages that you can flick through, essentially using a viewer, for example. So it gives you kind of structure about chapters, etc. And this is now being supported in video as well in its earliest version, in its newest versions. And I think there might be some potential, hopefully in the future, to look at this in terms of being able to present different versions of an object in terms of moving image. So I mentioned audio. It could be that IIIF in the future might allow us to present multiple soundtracks in a standardized framework online, so that the user themselves could switch between the channels and decide which is the one that they want to listen to. It could be that it allows us to present in the same record a view which shows you the edge information on a film. So I think there's lots of potential there. I mean, I appreciate that would also potentially increase the need for resources, and there need to be some scoping, but I think there's lots of potential in terms of what we might be able to do in terms of presenting our material and preserving information about it in different ways in the future. And just to close there, last May, Stephen McConaughey, who's the head of digital at the British Film Institute, had actually tweeted that they'd adopted IIIF for their still images at the British Film Institute. So it might be that in the future, this kind of becomes something that is developed in the film preservation networks that we have, maybe coming out of, again, No Time to Wait. I mean, I saw a presentation at No Time to Wait about IIIF and video quite recently. So there might be potential there in the future. So yeah, that's kind of the presentation, looking at different aspects of what we do under this topic of preserving the unpreservable. I hope there was some useful information there. But yeah, I kind of really want to emphasize the importance of kind of staff and knowledge, obviously resource to do this kind of work, kind of knowledge sharing and the way that we learn and share information about this work. Policy and strategy being really important, and how that helps us develop systems and workflows and having buy-in from people. And it's been really useful for us in that network and that lead from the British Film Institute in terms of having the confidence to adopt, for example, FFV1. And so, yeah, that's kind of the presentation. I hope you found it useful. As I say, my email address is here if you'd like to get in contact if you have any questions. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing people in the panel discussion on Thursday later this week. Thank you very much.